A donkey and a zebra can literally have a baby together. Scientists call it a zonkey, and yes, it looks exactly like you're imagining. That single fact tells you how closely related these two animals really are. They belong to the same genus, share the same basic skeleton, the same teeth, the same digestive system built for grinding tough grass. For thousands of years, humans took one of these animals and turned it into one of the most important working animals in history, carrying water, grain, people, and entire trade economies across deserts on its back. The other animal, humans mostly just looked at, painted it, put it behind a fence, occasionally tried to ride it, and ended up in a hospital. So here's the obvious question nobody quite asks out loud. If humans could tame the donkey's wild ancestor, a stubborn desert animal built for one of the harshest environments on the planet, why couldn't they do the same thing with an animal that looks almost exactly like a striped horse? Same family, same basic body plan, same continent in many cases, and yet one became a global economic tool and the other became a zoo exhibit. The lazy answer is that zebras are just wild and untamable, end of story. But that's not really an explanation. It's just a restatement of the mystery with more confidence. Plenty of wild animals got domesticated eventually. Wolves became golden retrievers. Wild boars became pigs that sleep in barns. So the real question is more specific and much stranger. What is actually different about a zebra's biology, behavior, and evolutionary history that made it resist 5,000 years of human effort while its closest cousin walked calmly into domestication? The answer involves a reflex you can't train out of an animal, a social structure that looks similar on the surface but works completely differently underneath, and a predator that has been hunting this animal for roughly 1 million years longer than lions have been hunting horses. Let's start with the part that actually surprises people, which is that humans didn't just assume zebras were wild and give up without trying. They tried, repeatedly, seriously, and with real money behind it. In the late 1800s, European colonists in Africa looked at zebras and saw an opportunity. Here was an animal that looked like a horse, was already adapted to African heat, African grasses, and African diseases that killed imported European horses by the thousands. If you could just get a saddle on it, you'd have the perfect colonial workhorse. So they tried. A British aristocrat named Walter Rothschild famously trained zebras to pull a carriage, and even drove that carriage through the streets of London to prove it could be done. It worked sort of as a demonstration, as a spectacle. It did not work as a scalable strategy for building an economy or an army. In Kenya, a doctor named Rosendo Ribeiro reportedly used a zebra to make house calls around Nairobi in the early 20th century, partly because it was practical and partly, frankly, because it was memorable. Farther south, colonial administrators in southern Africa experimented with zebras pulling carts and wagons. Some of these attempts produced usable results for short periods, under close supervision with a lot of patience. None of them produced a domesticated population that bred reliably in captivity, worked predictably under saddle or harness, and could be handed off from one generation of animals and handlers to the next. That last part is the actual definition of domestication, and it's a much higher bar than we got one zebra to behave for a photograph. So, the historical record is clear on one point. This wasn't a case of humans never trying. This was a case of humans trying for over a century, in multiple countries, with real economic incentive, and still failing to produce a domesticated zebra population. That's the first thing that should make you suspicious that something deeper is going on. To understand what that something is, you have to go back millions of years, long before any human ever looked at either animal. Horses, donkeys, and zebras all descend from a common ancestor that lived roughly 55 million years ago, a small forest-dwelling animal barely the size of a house cat. Over tens of millions of years, that lineage split, spread, and diversified into different branches of the genus Equus, each shaped by a different environment. The donkey's wild ancestor, the African wild ass, evolved in the deserts and semi-arid scrublands of northeastern Africa, A landscape with real predators, but also with a lot of open, sparse terrain, where a fast prey animal could simply outrun trouble. The zebra's ancestors evolved on the open grasslands of eastern and southern Africa, sharing that landscape with an entire guild of large, coordinated, highly skilled predators, lions, hyenas, leopards, wild dogs, and cheetahs, all hunting in an ecosystem that had been running that predator-prey arms race for an extraordinarily long time. This matters more than it sounds like it should. Evolution doesn't build a personality out of nothing. It builds behavior the same way it builds a rib cage or a hoof, through generations of survival pressure, acting on whatever variation already exists. An animal that survives in a landscape thick with ambush predators needs a nervous system tuned for extreme split-second reactivity. An animal whose main predator problem is run in a straight line away from a slower threat across open desert does not need that same hair trigger wiring. That difference in ancestral environment planted the seed for everything that came after. Now here's where the story gets specific, because this isn't just a vague claim about zebras being more nervous. Zebras have a documented reflex that trainers and researchers specifically point to as a domestication breaker. When a rope, a lasso, or anything resembling a restraint comes toward a zebra's neck or head, it instinctively ducks and twists away, almost like a boxer slipping a punch. This isn't something the animal learns, it's built in, the same way a human flinches at a sudden loud noise near their face. For a hunter-gatherer or an early herder trying to physically capture and restrain a wild equid, that single reflex turns a task that already requires skill and rope into something close to impossible on any meaningful scale. You can't domesticate a population of animals one exhausting, dangerous capture at a time. Domestication requires a pathway where enough individuals can be caught, contained, and bred generation after generation without the process being lethal or economically ruinous for the humans doing it. And the ducking reflex isn't the only physical defense zebras carry. Their kick has been documented as powerful enough to break a lion's jaw, which tells you something important. This isn't an animal that evolved to simply flee and hope for the best. It evolved a genuine offensive weapon as a backup plan, because in its ecosystem, sometimes running isn't an option, and the only alternative to being eaten is fighting back hard enough that the predator decides you're not worth the risk. Combine that kick with a bite that handlers and zoo staff consistently describe as unusually severe compared to horses, and you get an animal whose default response to being grabbed, restrained, or cornered is not submission, it's violence, executed with real physical tools behind it. Compare that to a horse. Horses do buck, bolt, and kick. Nobody is claiming horses are gentle by nature, but horses evolved primarily on the open steppes of Central Asia, a landscape where the dominant survival strategy against wolves and other pursuit predators was speed and group vigilance rather than close-range combat. A horse under stress overwhelmingly tries to run first. A cornered zebra is statistically far more likely to fight, and fight in a way specifically evolved to disable something as large and dangerous as a lion. That's not a minor behavioral quirk. That's a completely different evolutionary strategy for surviving predation, and it produces a completely different animal to try to work with. So far, this sounds like a simple story about temperament, and if that were the whole answer, it would already be interesting. But there's a second layer, and it's about social structure, which turns out to matter just as much as raw aggression. Successful domestication in mammals tends to depend on something specific, a natural social hierarchy that humans can essentially insert themselves into. Wolves live in structured packs with dominant and subordinate roles, which is part of why dogs are so responsive to human leadership cues. We're just occupying a role their instincts already expect to exist. Horses similarly live in bands with a clear structure, typically led by a dominant mare, with a stable, relatively stable pecking order that individual horses learn to navigate and, crucially, defer to. A human handler can step into something close to that dominant role, and a horse's instincts are already primed to accept direction from a consistent, confident leader. Zebra social structure looks superficially similar from a distance: herds, groups, movement together across the plains. But researchers who have spent years studying zebra behavior in the wild most notably the biologist Hans Klingel, found that the underlying social relationships are far less rigid and far less hierarchical than they appear. Plain zebra groups do form family units, but the bonds and dominance patterns within and between groups are looser, more fluid, and less centered on a single, stable leadership structure that an outside human could realistically substitute themselves into. Where a horse essentially treats a skilled trainer as the new alpha of the herd, a zebra doesn't have as clean an equivalent role for a human to step into, because the zebra's own social world doesn't run on quite the same predictable chain of command. This is the same trait paradox that keeps showing up throughout the animal kingdom, and it's worth sitting with for a second. The zebra's alertness, its independence, its refusal to easily accept a dominant outsider. These aren't flaws. They are precisely the traits that kept its ancestors alive for hundreds of thousands of years in one of the most predator-dense ecosystems on Earth. The very qualities that make a zebra spectacularly good at surviving lions are the same qualities that make it spectacularly bad at accepting a human as its new herd leader. Now, at this point, an intelligent viewer should be raising an objection, and it's a fair one. Couldn't humans just selectively breed the calmer individuals over generations, the same way they did with foxes, dogs, and pretty much every domesticated species in history? In principle, yes, this is theoretically possible, and researchers studying the science of domestication generally agree there's no absolute biological law forbidding it. In practice, it runs into a brutal chicken and egg problem. Selective breeding for tameness requires managing large numbers of individual animals in captivity across many generations, choosing the calmest ones to breed, and repeating that process patiently over centuries. But managing large numbers of zebras in captivity safely, at the scale needed to run that kind of breeding program, is exactly the problem that the ducking reflex, the kicking, the biting, and the loose social structure make so difficult in the first place. It's a trap that closes on itself. You need controlled breeding to make the animal manageable, but you need the animal to already be somewhat manageable to run controlled breeding at any real scale. Early human societies without modern veterinary tools, tranquilizers, hydraulic squeeze chutes, or reinforced steel enclosures simply didn't have the technology to force their way through that trap the way a modern zoo or research facility might. And that gap in available technology mattered for a very long historical window, because the animals that did get domesticated, cattle, sheep, goats, horses, donkeys, were all domesticated thousands of years before anyone had access to the kind of equipment that could safely contain a genuinely dangerous, evasive wild animal during a multi-generational breeding program. By the time humans in the modern era actually had that kind of technology, the economic and cultural role that horses and donkeys already occupied was locked in so completely that there was no longer any real incentive to spend a century trying to retrofit a zebra into a job that was already being done well by something else. This is where the story stops being only about biology and starts becoming about timing. And timing turns out to be one of the most underrated forces in the entire history of domestication. Now, compare all of this to the donkey's wild ancestor, the African wild ass, and the contrast becomes genuinely striking. Genetic research places donkey domestication in northeastern Africa somewhere around 5 to 6,000 years ago, likely tied to pastoralist communities responding to the Sahara region becoming drier and less hospitable, which pushed people toward a more mobile lifestyle that needed a sturdy pack animal. The African wild ass evolved in a harsh, resource-scarce, comparatively open desert environment, with a very different predator landscape than the zebra's grassland home. Its ancestral survival strategy leaned much more heavily on endurance, water efficiency, and straightforward flight across open terrain, rather than on close-quarters combat against an entire ecosystem of coordinated predators. That difference in evolutionary background produced an animal that, while still famously stubborn and independent-minded, has a nervous system that doesn't carry the same hair-trigger weaponized defensive package that the zebra does. Early African pastoralists were able to capture, contain, and gradually breed wild asses in numbers large enough to establish a genuinely domesticated population, one that could be passed down, bred selectively over generations, and relied upon economically. Within a relatively short span of time by historical standards, the donkey became essential infrastructure carrying water across expanding deserts, hauling goods along the earliest overland trade routes, linking Africa to the Middle East, and later helping supply Roman armies and Silk Road caravans thousands of years afterward. None of that required the donkey to be an easy or endlessly cooperative animal. It required the donkey to be capturable, breedable in captivity at scale, and survivable to work with, which turned out to be a fundamentally lower bar than what the zebra presented. So the donkey cleared the threshold that domestication actually requires, while the zebra, evolving under a completely different set of predator pressures, never quite did. This is also where it's worth pausing to test the premise of the original question itself, because part of doing this honestly means not overselling the mystery. Some individual zebras across history clearly have been tamed to a limited degree. There are documented cases, including a Virginia teenager in the early 2000s who spent months training a young zebra to accept a rider, with results she herself described as wildly inconsistent from one day to the next. Zoos and private handlers have occasionally raised individual zebras that tolerate human contact reasonably well. So the claim isn't that zebras are biologically incapable of any human interaction whatsoever. The claim is narrower and honestly more interesting. Taming an individual animal through intensive, patient, one-on-one effort is a completely different achievement than domesticating a species, which requires predictable behavior, reliable captive breeding, and manageable temperament across thousands of animals and countless generations, passed down as a stable trait rather than a personal training project. Horses and donkeys cleared that second, much harder bar. Zebras, despite real and repeated human effort, never have. Now let's climb up to the level of actual historical consequence, because this is where a question about an animal's temperament turns into a question about the shape of continents. When Europeans arrived in Africa with domesticated horses, they weren't bringing some kind of overwhelming, unbeatable technology, but they were bringing an animal that gave them faster communication, cavalry mobility, and logistical reach that many African societies, lacking an equivalent large domesticated riding animal south of the Sahara, could not immediately match in the same form. This wasn't purely a story about zebras, it's worth being precise here, because a large part of the reason horses struggle to spread and thrive across much of sub-Saharan Africa involves a completely separate factor, the tsetse fly, which carries a parasitic disease called trypanosomiasis that is frequently lethal to horses, but that many native African wildlife species, including zebras, have some degree of natural tolerance toward. So Africa's indigenous environment created a strange, double-sided situation. It hosted an equid, the zebra, that carried natural resistance to a disease that devastated imported domesticated horses in large parts of the continent. And yet that same equid was behaviorally resistant to becoming the very animal that could have filled the ecological and military role the horse played elsewhere. It's tempting to imagine an alternate history where zebra cavalry rides through Africa, the way horse cavalry once dominated the plains of Eurasia, but the biology and behavior we've just walked through explain in concrete terms why that version of history never happened. This is the kind of geographic and biological asymmetry that researchers like Jared Diamond pointed to when trying to explain why certain regions of the world developed large-scale animal-powered agriculture, trade, and militaries earlier and more extensively than others. An idea sometimes summarized as the observation that successful domestication requires an animal to check off a long list of specific behavioral and biological boxes, and missing even one of them can be enough to keep a species wild indefinitely, no matter how useful it might otherwise be. None of this means Africa lacked its own extensive, sophisticated, domesticated animal economies. Cattle herding across much of the continent has a long and deeply significant history of its own. But the specific niche that horses filled in Eurasia, fast individual riding and messaging, cavalry mobility, rapid long-distance communication, simply didn't have an equivalent large domesticated equid available on the African side of that particular equation, and the zebra's evolutionary history is the central reason why. So let's come back to the original comparison and pull all of this together. A donkey and a zebra really are close enough relatives to interbreed, and on paper they look like they should have had similar shots at domestication. But the donkey's wild ancestor evolved in a desert landscape where the main survival strategy was endurance and straightforward flight, producing an animal that, while stubborn, could realistically be captured, contained, and bred in captivity by early human societies without modern tools. The zebra's ancestors evolved for hundreds of thousands of years inside one of the most intensely predator-saturated grassland ecosystems on the planet, alongside lions, hyenas, and wild dogs that had been refining their hunting strategies for an extraordinarily long time. That environment selected for a nervous system built around instant extreme reactivity, a genuine defensive weapon in the kick and the bite, an automatic ducking reflex that defeats rope-based restraint almost by design, and a social structure loose enough that a human handler can't simply slot into an existing chain of command the way they can with a horse. Every one of those traits made the zebra extraordinarily good at surviving in the wild. And every one of those same traits made it almost uniquely difficult to fold into the kind of managed, multi-generational breeding relationship that domestication actually requires. Humans didn't fail to try. Rothschild's carriage rolled through London, Ribeiro's zebra carried him across Nairobi, colonial administrators across southern Africa spent real money and real years on the experiment, and every attempt ran into the same evolutionary wall. The zebra was never rejected by humans for being useless. It was, in a very real sense, too well adapted to its own world to fit comfortably into ours. And that's really the quiet twist sitting underneath this whole question. We tend to assume domestication is something humans simply impose on animals through willpower and enough generations of patience, but the truth is closer to the opposite. Domestication only happens when a species already arrives carrying a very specific, almost accidental combination of ancient traits, shaped by pressures that had nothing to do with humans at all, that just happen to line up with what we need. The zebra spent a million years perfecting exactly the wrong set of skills for that particular door to open, while its cousin, shaped by a quieter, harsher, more solitary desert, ended up perfectly positioned to walk through it. So the next time you see a zebra standing calmly behind a fence at a zoo, remember that its calmness there is a kind of illusion. Underneath it is still the same animal that evolved to duck a lion's claws and shatter a jawbone with a single kick, running on instincts written by a world we never got the chance to fully tame.